3 pages, 370 words, written on paper found inside the house using a pen that was later placed carefully back in its holder. For nearly 30 years, investigators, linguists, and handwriting experts have returned to those 3 pages again and again, because so much of what actually happened inside the Ramsey home on December 26, 1996, may be hidden not in the crime scene, but in the words themselves. Some of the country's top forensic document examiners came to a striking conclusion. The note reads less like a genuine ransom demand and more like something written, revised, and performed. A script. Today we examine exactly what the evidence shows, what remains genuinely disputed, and why this single document remains the most analyzed piece of paper in American true crime history. This is the story of the JonBené Ramsey ransom note, told through the actual forensic and linguistic analysis conducted on it over nearly 3 decades, not tabloid speculation, not internet theory. We'll walk through what handwriting experts found, what they disagreed on, and why, even in 2026, no one has been able to say with certainty who wrote it. Before we go further, if you want true crime coverage built on documented evidence rather than sensational headlines, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you catch our next deep dive. We examine every theory with the same scrutiny, without declaring anyone guilty who has never been charged or convicted in a court of law. Hit that like button if you're here for the facts, and tell us in the comments what you think this note actually reveals. Now let's go back to where it was found. At approximately 5:45 on the morning of December 26, 1996, Patsy Ramsey came down the spiral staircase of her family's Boulder, Colorado home. Partway down, she found 3 handwritten pages laid out on one of the steps. It was a ransom note. It claimed her 6-year-old daughter, JonBené, had been taken. It demanded $118,000 for her safe return. Before we examine the note's content, it's worth understanding the family at its center, because context matters for everything that follows. John Ramsey, 53 years old in 1996, was the CEO of Access Graphics, a computer services company that had grown into a $1 billion-a-year subsidiary of a major aerospace contractor. Patsy Ramsey, 40, was a former Miss West Virginia who had traded pageant crowns for motherhood while maintaining, by every account, a polished, detail-oriented approach to life. Their children, Burke, 9, and JonBené, 6, lived with them in a 15-room Tudor-style home in one of Boulder's most affluent neighborhoods, a roughly 7,000-square-foot house valued at approximately $700,000 at the time, with a sprawling basement containing a boiler room, storage areas, a train room belonging to Burke, and a small wine cellar at the far end, a room whose existence would become central to everything that followed. The Ramseys had spent the Christmas season attending parties, decorating elaborately, and preparing for JonBené's ongoing participation in children's beauty pageants, an activity that would later become a significant part of national media coverage of the case and a source of public debate about the appropriateness of dressing young children in adult-styled costumes and makeup for competition. On Christmas evening, the family attended a gathering at the home of close friends, Fleet and Priscilla White. JonBené played with other children and ate food at the party, including a small amount of shrimp, according to the autopsy findings. The family left around 9 or 9:30 that evening. According to both John and Patsy's accounts, JonBené fell asleep in the car on the drive home. John carried her upstairs, stating he put her directly into bed without changing her clothes, still wearing the black velvet pants and red turtleneck she'd worn to the party. Patsy checked on both children before retiring herself. Everything, by every account from that night, seemed ordinary. The family had an early flight planned. John intended to fly them himself to Michigan the next morning to spend part of the holiday with his adult children from a previous marriage. Patsy laid out clothes for the trip before going to bed around 10, including a red turtleneck and black pants for JonBené to wear. The house grew quiet. That's the official account of that night, the one both parents would maintain with only minor variations for the following 3 decades. What we know for certain is that sometime between that moment and 5:45 the next morning, JonBené died inside that home. And on the staircase, Patsy found the note that would go on to become the single most scrutinized document in the history of American criminal investigation. Let's examine exactly what made this note stand out to investigators from the very first reading. Officer Rick French, one of the first responding officers, arrived at the home minutes after Patsy's frantic 911 call and picked up the note to read it. Even to a patrol officer with no specialized training in kidnapping cases, something about it felt immediately wrong. It was long, unusually long for a ransom note. Genuine ransom demands, the kind law enforcement actually encounters in real kidnapping cases, tend to be short, direct, and businesslike, designed to communicate an instruction quickly and leave. This one rambled across nearly 3 full pages. The note began, "Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We respect your business, but not the country that it serves. At this time, we have your daughter in our possession. She is safe and unharmed, and if you want her to see 1997, you must follow our instructions to the letter." It went on to demand $118,000 in cash, specified in $20 and $100 bills, to be placed in a brown paper bag. It warned John not to contact police, threatening that speaking to anyone about the situation, including police or the FBI, would result in JonBené being harmed. It stated the writer would call between 8 and 10 the next morning with delivery instructions, adding that the delivery itself would be exhausting, so John should be well rested, an oddly considerate detail for a document meant to threaten a family. The note continued with language that struck investigators and later linguists as strange for a genuine criminal document. Phrases like, "Don't underestimate us," and "Use that good Southern common sense of yours" felt, to several analysts, more like dialogue lifted from crime films than the language of actual kidnappers. Investigators and linguists both noted that certain phrasing bore resemblance to lines from popular films of the era, suggesting a writer drawing on cinematic or fictional influences rather than genuine criminal experience. It referenced John's business, Access Graphics, by name, described him as one of many fat cats, and mentioned an amount that would prove to be one of the most significant details in the entire case. The note was signed, Victory, SBTC. Those initials have never been definitively explained. Theories over the decades have ranged from religious references, such as "saved by the cross," to military terminology, to acronyms connected to obscure organizations, to the possibility that the letters were simply meaningless, chosen specifically to mislead investigators and generate exactly this kind of endless speculation. Here's where the physical evidence around the note becomes just as significant as its content. The 3 pages came from a notepad found inside the Ramsey home, kept in the kitchen area where Patsy stored notepads for lists and notes. The pen used was a black Sharpie felt tip marker, also from inside the house, later found placed back in a cup on the kitchen counter alongside other writing implements. Whoever wrote this note didn't bring materials with them. They used what was already there, and at least one item was returned to its usual spot afterward. A small but telling detail about the writer's state of mind and level of composure in the moments after the note was completed. Investigators also discovered something else on that same notepad, a practice attempt. On one page, someone had begun writing Mr. and Mrs. R, then stopped, apparently reconsidering, before starting over addressing the note only to John. This detail matters enormously for understanding how the note was likely composed. It suggests the writer wasn't rushed, wasn't operating in a state of pure panic without any capacity for deliberation, but rather sat down, made a decision, reconsidered it, and started again. Writing and revising a document of this length, testing out an opening line before discarding it, takes time and a level of composure that doesn't easily fit the profile of a stranger who has just broken into an occupied home in the middle of the night, with a family sleeping just floors away, and every additional minute inside the residence increasing the risk of discovery. Then there's the dollar amount itself, arguably the single most debated detail connected to this document. $118,000 doesn't match typical ransom demands, which tend to be round numbers chosen for their simplicity, not precision. But it closely mirrored, almost to the dollar, a bonus John Ramsey had recently received from his company. This wasn't public information. It wasn't the kind of detail that would appear in a newspaper profile or be casually known outside people connected to the family's private finances. Whoever wrote this note appears to have known something specific and personal about the Ramsey household's financial life, a detail that has fueled speculation in every direction for nearly 30 years, toward a disgruntled employee with access to company records, toward someone close enough to the family to have overheard private conversations, or toward someone inside the household itself. Now let's get into the handwriting analysis itself, because this is where the case around this document becomes genuinely complicated and where the term script starts to take on real forensic meaning. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation analyzed the note early in the investigation and could not eliminate Patsy Ramsey as its author. That's a critical, precise distinction worth sitting with. Not eliminate, not confirm. Multiple additional experts, hired separately by both the prosecution's side and the family's defense team, examined the writing over the following years, and their conclusions varied significantly, illustrating just how contested this specific forensic discipline can be when applied to a document this consequential. One CBI handwriting expert, Chet Ubowski, stated there were similarities between the note and Patsy's known writing samples, but not enough to constitute a definitive match. A separate forensic document examiner, Larry Ziegler, concluded Patsy probably didn't write it, pointing to specific structural differences in letter formation that he believed argued against her authorship. Another examiner, Leonard Specken, believed she likely did write it. Yet another, Gideon Epstein, stated with what he described as high confidence that Patsy was the author, citing particular consistencies across dozens of comparison samples. This lack of consensus among trained, credentialed experts illustrates something important about handwriting analysis as a forensic discipline. It is not an exact science in the way DNA testing is. People can disguise their handwriting. Writing can be produced with the non-dominant hand to alter its appearance, slowing the writer down and changing the natural formation of letters. Someone could theoretically attempt to imitate another person's writing style, whether to genuinely implicate them or as an elaborate act of framing. Or the true author's handwriting could simply share certain characteristics with Patsy's by pure coincidence, given how common certain stylistic tendencies are across a population. What is not in dispute is this. Nearly every expert who examined the note agreed that John Ramsey did not write it. His letter formations, his natural writing style, and other identifying characteristics were sufficiently different that he was ruled out by consensus among the examiners, a conclusion that is held consistently across every subsequent review of the case. Burke Ramsey, 9 years old at the time, was also ruled out. His handwriting samples didn't match, and beyond that, the vocabulary, sentence structure, and overall complexity of the note were considered well beyond what a child of his age would typically produce unprompted, even accounting for unusually advanced verbal ability. This left the field narrowed to two possibilities that have defined the case ever since: Patsy Ramsey, who experts could not eliminate as the author, or an unidentified individual outside the family, whose handwriting has never been compared against Patsy's known writing because their identity remains, to this day, unknown. Linguistic analysis added another layer to this debate, one that deserves careful, honest treatment. James Fitzgerald, a forensic linguist who had previously worked on the Unabomber investigation, one of the most significant applications of linguistic profiling in American criminal history, examined the note's language, structure, and word choices. He pointed to specific elements, the placement of exclamation points, certain capitalization patterns, particular phrasing, and the overall dramatic, almost theatrical tone of the document, and concluded that these elements were consistent with what he understood of Patsy's natural communication style and personality, based on comparison against other writing samples attributed to her. It's important to present this honestly and fairly. This was Fitzgerald's professional assessment, based on his expertise in forensic linguistics, not a definitive scientific finding accepted universally by every expert who reviewed the case. Other linguists who examined the same document reached different conclusions or declined to draw firm conclusions at all, arguing that linguistic profiling of this kind carries inherent subjectivity and can be shaped by an investigator's existing assumptions about who they expect the author to be. A criticism that has been leveled at behavioral and linguistic analysis techniques more broadly across forensic science. The debate among professionals in this specific field has never been fully resolved, and it remains, even now, one of the more actively contested aspects of the forensic record in this case. Discussed and re-examined in documentaries, academic papers, and continuing legal analysis well into 2026. This is precisely why some who have studied this case closely describe the note not simply as a ransom demand, but as something closer to a script, a document that reads, in its length, its internal contradictions, and its almost narrative structure, as though it was composed to construct and sustain a story, rather than to actually accomplish a kidnapping. Consider the internal logic problems this framing raises. If an intruder genuinely wrote this note intending to hold JonBené for ransom, the sequence of events becomes very difficult to reconcile with what we know happened. Writing the note before entering the home doesn't explain why it used materials found only inside the house. Writing it after entering while the family slept means spending 20 to 30 minutes or more composing and revising a lengthy document inside an occupied residence in the middle of the night, an enormous risk for anyone attempting to avoid detection, particularly in a house with 3 other people asleep just rooms away. And if, based on the medical evidence establishing JonBenét's estimated time of death, somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning according to the coroner's assessment based on rigor mortis, lividity, and stomach contents, she was already gone. By the time this note would have been read, the entire ransom demand becomes functionally meaningless. It couldn't produce payment. It couldn't facilitate any actual exchange. Whatever purpose it served viewed through this lens may have had little to do with genuinely obtaining money, and much more to do with constructing a narrative, buying time, or redirecting the initial hours of the investigation toward an external threat rather than toward the house itself and toward whoever or whatever had actually happened inside it that night. It's crucial to state clearly what this theory does and does not establish. If the note was written inside the home by someone connected to the family, in a state of shock or panic following JonBenét's death, that would help explain several of its most puzzling features. Its unusual length, as someone attempts to construct a convincing scenario under extreme duress, filling pages with detail in an effort to make the fiction feel substantial and real. Its practice draft, suggesting genuine uncertainty about how to begin rather than the confident, prepared hand of someone who had planned this specific act in advance. Its references to fictional, movie-style kidnapping language, drawn from a writer with no real experience crafting an actual criminal document, relying instead on cultural touchstones absorbed from film and television. And its inclusion of the precise bonus figure, a detail that, in a moment of panic, might slip out as an attempt to make the demand feel personally significant and real, inadvertently revealing insider knowledge in the process. The kind of detail someone might reach for specifically because it felt convincingly large and specific, without fully considering how few people outside the household would actually know it. This remains a theory, one that a number of investigators, forensic document examiners, and linguists have found genuinely compelling based on the internal evidence of the note itself. It is not a proven fact. No court has ever ruled on it. No charges connected to writing the note have ever been filed against anyone. Patsy Ramsey was never convicted of any crime connected to JonBenét's death, and she consistently, until her death in 2006, denied writing the note or having any involvement in her daughter's murder. There is an equally serious alternative explanation that deserves the same level of respect and scrutiny. Because responsible coverage of this case requires presenting both sides with genuine fairness, rather than favoring the theory that makes for a more dramatic narrative. If the note was written by an intruder, someone genuinely unconnected to the family, several details become explainable in different ways. Perhaps this individual had scouted the home in advance. During a Christmas home tour the Ramseys had opened to the public weeks earlier, an event that brought a number of strangers through the house and its rooms, gaining familiarity with the home's layout and even, potentially, glimpsing household items or overhearing information about the family's finances during casual conversation. Perhaps they brought a plan already partially formed and improvised, using materials found on site once inside, adapting their approach to what was available rather than what they'd originally intended. Perhaps their unusual, almost theatrical language reflects not staging by a family member, but the psychology of a genuinely disturbed individual, drawing on media and film influences in a real, if deeply strange, criminal act. The kind of behavior forensic psychologists have documented in other cases involving offenders whose sense of criminal conduct is shaped more by fictional portrayals than lived experience. Under this theory, the DNA evidence becomes the central supporting pillar, and it's worth walking through it in real detail because it represents the strongest physical evidence connected to any theory in this entire case. In 1997, forensic testing identified DNA from an unknown male, mixed with a small amount of blood found in JonBenét's underwear. It did not match John Ramsey. It did not match Patsy. It did not match Burke. It did not match any of the family friends who submitted samples during the investigation. Entered into the FBI's National Criminal Database, it produced no match to anyone with a prior record, meaning whoever this DNA belonged to had never been convicted of a crime requiring their profile to be on file anywhere in the country. In 2008, using newer touch DNA technology, a method capable of extracting genetic material from skin cells transferred through simple contact, investigators tested the waistband of the long underwear JonBenet was wearing and identified what they described as the same unidentified male genetic profile in that separate location. This is a significant finding worth pausing on. Finding matching genetic material in two different locations, on two different garments the child was wearing at the time of her death, makes a purely innocent, coincidental explanation considerably less statistically likely than a single isolated trace would. Based on this finding, then District Attorney Mary Lacey sent a formal letter to John Ramsey in July of 2008, stating that her office believed this DNA evidence exonerated the family, and that investigators should focus their efforts on identifying an unknown male suspect. The letter stated plainly that the match of male DNA on two separate items of clothing worn by JonBenet at the time of the murder made clear that an unknown male had handled these items and that there was no innocent explanation for its incriminating presence at two separate locations. Patsy had died from ovarian cancer in 2006, 2 years earlier, and did not live to see this statement issued on her family's behalf, a fact John Ramsey has referenced repeatedly and with visible pain in interviews over the years since, describing the particular cruelty of his wife dying under a cloud of suspicion that the evidence would, only afterward, formally lift. It's important, in the interest of complete honesty, to note that this exoneration has never been universally accepted as conclusive, even among investigators and forensic experts closely familiar with this case. The DNA quantities involved were extremely small, at levels where contamination during manufacturing, packaging, or retail handling becomes a real possibility, particularly given that both items of clothing were recently purchased and had never been washed. The long underwear itself, notably, was sized 12 to 14, considerably larger than JonBenét's actual size 6, with Patsy later explaining she had purchased it in advance as a future gift for an older cousin and simply kept it stored in the house, a detail that has never been fully reconciled with why JonBenet would have been found wearing it that night, since her original clothing from the party was never located and is presumed to have been taken from the scene. Some experts have suggested that genetic material recovered from these items could have originated from a worker at the manufacturing facility, someone who handled the items during shipping or retail stocking, or someone who touched them while stored inside the Ramsey home prior to that night. Others have pointed out that DNA samples in this case showed some evidence of mixture, potentially containing genetic material from more than one contributor, which complicates straightforward interpretation of the results. In 2009, the Boulder Police Department, resuming primary control of the investigation from the district attorney's office, publicly stated it did not consider the DNA evidence conclusive on its own. That more cautious institutional position, notably different from District Attorney Lacey's letter, has never been fully reversed, even as testing methods and institutional openness to new forensic approaches have continued evolving through 2025 and into this year. This same fundamental disagreement resurfaced publicly in 2016 when CBS aired a documentary suggesting Burke Ramsey, 9 years old at the time of his sister's death, may have been involved in causing her fatal injuries, theorizing that his parents subsequently staged the ransom note and kidnapping scenario to protect him. Burke filed a $750 million defamation lawsuit against the network, its producers, and several experts featured in the special. During the litigation that followed, expert witnesses on both sides testified extensively about the DNA evidence, some arguing it was likely probative of an intruder's involvement, others maintaining it was more plausibly explained by innocent contamination and shouldn't be treated as reliable evidence of an outside perpetrator's presence. The case was ultimately settled under undisclosed terms in 2019, but the competing expert testimony presented during that litigation illustrated, in a legal setting, just how genuinely unresolved this specific forensic question has remained across multiple, well-funded, professional examinations of the same underlying evidence. Where does the current, ongoing effort to resolve this specific disagreement actually stand right now in 2026? For years, that unidentified DNA profile sat without being run through forensic genetic genealogy, the same technique that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018 after more than 4 decades. According to John Ramsey's family, the existing sample hasn't yet been considered complete or sensitive enough for current genealogical technology to reliably process it into a usable profile, a genuine technical limitation rather than simple institutional refusal, they say, though one that has still meant nearly 30 years without resolution. That's begun to shift somewhat in the current environment. Throughout 2025 and into this year, Boulder officials, working alongside federal partners and evaluating outside independent laboratories, have acknowledged more directly than in years past that they're actively exploring advanced DNA testing capabilities specifically suited to processing this kind of complex, degraded sample. John Ramsey, now 82, has continued to publicly and specifically advocate for this exact testing, meeting with Boulder's police chief, circulating a public petition in 2022 that gathered more than 16,000 signatures, and even appealing directly to federal officials for assistance in moving the case toward resolution. This past summer, a Colorado Bureau of Investigation forensic analyst pleaded guilty to charges related to mishandling DNA evidence across more than 1,000 unrelated cases spanning nearly 2 decades of her employment, a scandal that briefly reignited public questions about whether JonBenét's case could have been affected. Both Boulder Police and the District Attorney's Office confirmed publicly that it was not, noting that the earliest, most critical DNA testing in this specific case had actually been conducted by an independent private laboratory, not the state crime lab at all. As of this recording, that genetic genealogy testing still has not identified a suspect. So where does this leave the ransom note, the document at the center of everything? It remains, even in 2026, genuinely unresolved. Was it a script, composed inside the house under unimaginable pressure by someone desperately trying to construct a story that would explain a tragedy that had already occurred? Or was it a strange, disturbing, but ultimately genuine document written by an intruder whose identity remains hidden inside an unmatched DNA profile, waiting for the right technology to finally identify them? Both interpretations have been argued, seriously and at length, by credentialed forensic professionals. Neither has been proven with the certainty a courtroom would require. No one has ever been charged in connection with writing this note. It's worth walking through, briefly and fairly, how the broader investigation treated Patsy Ramsey specifically over the following years, because her connection to this note shaped much of how the public came to view her right up until her death. Within hours of JonBenét's body being found, the family retained prominent criminal defense attorneys, a decision critics at the time pointed to as suspicious, though the family and their supporters have consistently explained it as advice received once it became clear investigators were treating them as potential suspects rather than as grieving victims. The Ramseys did not sit for formal, complete interviews with police for several months, a delay that frustrated investigators seeking immediate, detailed access, but one the family's attorneys have said was necessary to protect their clients' rights during an unusually intense period of public and institutional scrutiny. When those interviews finally took place in May of 1997, they were conducted separately, on different days, under specific conditions negotiated in advance by legal counsel, an arrangement that further complicated an already strained relationship between the family and law enforcement. In April of 1997, John and Patsy appeared together on a nationally televised interview, denying any involvement in their daughter's death and maintaining that an intruder was responsible. Patsy, in a separate interview, was directly asked whether she had killed JonBenét. Her response, delivered with visible emotion, was unequivocal. She stated plainly that she loved her daughter and had nothing to do with her death. How that moment, and others like it throughout the following years, should be interpreted as the genuine anguish of a grieving mother, or as something more calculated, has divided viewers and professional observers alike for nearly 3 decades, and it's simply not something that can be resolved definitively through demeanor alone. Courts have never treated composure, or its absence, as evidence of guilt or innocence in any legal proceeding connected to this case, a principle that applies equally to both John and Patsy Ramsey across every documented interaction with police and media throughout this investigation. Patsy's own handwriting samples, provided voluntarily and repeatedly to investigators over the following years, added another layer of complexity to this already contested picture. Some experts who compared her post-1996 writing samples to samples predating JonBenét's death noted what they described as subtle shifts in style, becoming, in their assessment, more deliberate and controlled than her earlier, more natural handwriting. This observation has been interpreted in 2 entirely opposite ways by different analysts. Some have suggested it could indicate a conscious effort to distance her current writing from the ransom notes style. Others have pointed out that significant psychological trauma and sustained public stress are well documented to affect a person's motor patterns and handwriting consistency over time, offering an entirely innocent explanation for the same observed change. As with so much else connected to this specific piece of evidence, there is no way to determine with certainty which interpretation is correct. In September of 1998, a Colorado grand jury was convened to review the full body of evidence, including extensive analysis of the ransom note itself, alongside every other piece of physical and testimonial evidence gathered by that point. The proceeding lasted over a year, one of the longest in state history, hearing testimony from dozens of witnesses and reviewing thousands of pages of documents. In October of 1999, District Attorney Alex Hunter announced publicly that he would not be filing charges, stating there was insufficient evidence to prosecute beyond a reasonable doubt. For 14 years, the public understood this to mean the grand jury had found insufficient grounds to indict anyone at all. That understanding turned out to be incomplete. In 2013, following a successful legal petition by a local newspaper, sealed grand jury documents were released, revealing that jurors had, in fact, voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey, though not for murder directly. The proposed charges would have been for child abuse resulting in death and for acting as an accessory to a crime, language suggesting the grand jury believed the couple may have known who was responsible for their daughter's death and helped conceal that information, rather than believing either parent had directly caused it themselves. Hunter ultimately declined to sign the indictment, stating publicly in subsequent explanations that he didn't believe the evidence, including the contested handwriting and DNA findings, would secure a conviction at trial. This decision remains, to this day, one of the most debated in the entire history of the case. Critics argued Hunter was effectively protecting a wealthy, well-connected family from prosecution. Supporters argued he was exercising exactly the kind of prudent, evidence-based judgment prosecutors are meant to apply, recognizing that a case built substantially on unresolved handwriting analysis and disputed DNA interpretation was unlikely to meet the demanding standard required for a criminal conviction. That decision, and the note's central role within the broader body of evidence the grand jury reviewed over 13 months, remains one of the most significant and least understood chapters in this case's entire history. Beyond the immediate family, investigators pursued numerous alternative suspects over the following years, underscoring just how seriously the intruder theory was taken by multiple waves of detectives working this case. Bill McReynolds, a retired journalism professor who had played Santa Claus at a Ramsey holiday gathering just days before JonBenét's death, drew early suspicion, particularly after it emerged that his wife had years earlier written a play involving a scenario disturbingly similar to the actual crime, a young girl killed in a basement. McReynolds provided hair and handwriting samples, submitted to interviews, and offered an alibi for the night in question. He was ultimately cleared and died in 2002, having maintained his innocence throughout. In 2006, a man named John Mark Carr, living in Thailand, contacted authorities and confessed in detail to killing JonBenét, claiming her death had been an accident. He was extradited to the United States amid intense media attention, But his DNA didn't match the unidentified male profile, and significant inaccuracies in his account of the crime scene ultimately led to his release without charges. A stark demonstration of how false confessions can complicate and consume investigative resources in high-profile cases like this one. The Boulder Police Department continues to describe this case as an open, active homicide investigation. Periodic public updates over the years have referenced ongoing DNA analysis and collaboration with state and federal partners, including statements issued around the 25th anniversary of JonBenét's death in December of 2021, reaffirming the department's stated commitment to solving the case. As of this recording, in 2026, no arrests have been made. No individual has been formally charged. The ransom note, examined by more forensic document experts than perhaps any other piece of evidence in American criminal history, remains exactly what it was on the morning it was found, unresolved. We know precisely what materials were used to create it. We know it was likely written inside the home, using paper and a pen taken from the family's own kitchen. We know handwriting experts could not eliminate Patsy Ramsey as its author, and could not confirm it either. We know it contained a detail, John's exact bonus figure, that strongly suggests insider knowledge of the family's private finances. And we know that despite nearly 30 years of analysis by some of the most credentialed document examiners and forensic linguists in the country, no one has ever been able to say, with the certainty a court of law requires, who actually held the pen. This case has generated an extraordinary volume of books, documentaries, podcasts, and public debate over the decades since JonBenét's death, more than almost any other unsolved homicide in modern American history. Some of that attention has been thoughtful and evidence-based. A significant amount of it has not, built instead on speculation, unverified theory, and the simple, undeniable pull of an unsolved mystery involving a young victim. Part of the case's enduring hold on public attention comes from its cast of characters: a successful executive, a former beauty queen, a striking, photogenic child performer, and part of it comes from the sheer volume of physical evidence that seems, depending on how you weigh it, to point in genuinely different directions at once. It's worth being direct about something here. Theories alleging that Patsy Ramsey deliberately planned or orchestrated her daughter's death, as opposed to potentially having written a note under panic after a death that had already occurred through other means, have never been supported by any physical evidence, have never been presented as established fact in any legal proceeding, and remain, at most, one interpretation among several genuinely competing theories that responsible examination of this case has to hold with real uncertainty. The cultural impact of this case extends well beyond the specific question of who wrote the note or who was ultimately responsible for JonBenét's death. Her case fundamentally shaped how American media covers major unsolved crimes, arriving at a moment when cable news was expanding into round-the-clock coverage capable of devoting sustained day-after-day attention to a single ongoing story. It sparked serious, lasting public conversation about the culture surrounding child beauty pageants, a conversation that continues in various forms today. And it became, for law enforcement agencies studying its early mistakes, a widely cited cautionary example in training on crime scene preservation, illustrating precisely what can go wrong when a scene is not immediately secured, when family and friends are allowed to move freely through a home before investigators fully understand what they're dealing with, and when institutional friction between police and prosecutors is allowed to shape the direction of an investigation rather than the evidence itself. What isn't in question, whatever the truth about that note ultimately is that a 6-year-old girl died inside her own home on Christmas night, and that nearly 3 decades later, no one has been held accountable. Her family, whatever the full truth about their own actions that night may be, has spent 30 years living inside a national obsession that has never let them go and never fully resolved. If this deep dive into the evidence surrounding this case's most debated document held your attention, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you catch our continued coverage as this story develops. Hit that like button if you appreciate thorough, fact-based analysis over sensational speculation, and tell us honestly in the comments, after hearing the actual documented handwriting and linguistic analysis laid out in full, what do you believe this note actually represents? A genuine ransom demand from an outsider, or something written inside that house in the desperate hours after tragedy had already struck? Remember, underneath every theory this case has generated for nearly 30 years, there is a real family that lost a child in the most devastating way imaginable. And there is a document, 3 pages, 370 words, that has never fully given up its secrets. JonBenét Ramsey deserves justice. Whoever is ultimately responsible for her death, whether the answer to who wrote that note is the same answer to who killed her, or an entirely separate question altogether, deserves to finally be identified, definitively, through evidence rather than speculation. Until that day comes, if it ever does, this remains what it has always been, one of America's most thoroughly examined and most stubbornly unsolved mysteries.